You need to, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and make sure that if things fall apart, that you are protected and can claw back what you need to, especially if you're providing your team members access to someone else's, business accounts and that type of thing. Hello and welcome to the Service-Based Business Society podcast. I am your host, Tiffany-Ann Bottcher. If you are ready to scale your success, grow your business, and live that entrepreneurial life, click subscribe because we're about to get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to talk about the fine lines of business. No, we're not talking about all of the fine lines and wrinkles that the stress of being a business owner gives you. That's not a topic that I am any kind of expert in. No, today we're going to be talking about the fine lines of it's this, but it's that. The opposites where we have to find the balance. Things where we want to be trusting, but we don't want to be naive. Things like that where you're like, hey, but it's this, but it's not that. A lot of times as we're going through the editing of these podcast episodes, I really realize how much the balancing act of business is, where we have really incredible, talented professionals talk about how we're going left. And then someone else will come in with another perspective or different value and talk about going right. And ultimately, it's for you to decide what is the best place for your business. We've talked about how it comes down to where you are in your journey. We've talked about, what skills and attributes you have, where your team, if you have one, what kind of skills and attributes they have. So today we're going to talk a bit about a few different places where really riding that fine line can really be a difference maker. 2025 is underway. It's crazy how fast January flies by and how we really have to remember that there's only 12 months in the year. There's this social post that gets me almost every time. It could move me to that kind of weepy emotional state, which isn't really my typical. And it talks about how many summers you get with your kids and how many weekends there are in a year and how you don't want to waste them. And it is always this piece, both as a mom and as well as a business owner. And there's another fine line right there where balancing personal life with business. It's always interesting when you have people who are giving such, specific advice. It was only maybe a month ago that Alex Hormozi, who is a big name online, shared a post and he talked about, and, I'm not going to paraphrase the post, but basically he talked about the fact that in order to build his successful business, he gave up everything personally. He didn't attend his friends' weddings. He didn't go on vacations. He didn't take weekends. He didn't do all of these things. And the clap back on that post, was strong. It was, don't tell me that I need to miss all of those things. And, don't tell me that that's the only way to be successful. And Alex did a great job coming back and saying, hey, I'm just sharing what worked for me. I'm not saying that's what you have to do. I'm saying that's what I did. And so, it's that balance, and it's the balance of where are you in life and what is important to you, and, deciding, hey, this year I'm going to focus on these things, and that year we're going to focus over here. So we're going to talk about those fine lines, and obviously the personal life versus business is such a key one. I've talked about it before. I have 3 kids. We have, 3 different businesses, and we have 2 puppies, which I guess, I don't know when you stop calling them puppies. They still act like puppies, so we're going to go with calling them puppies. But it's busy. My kids are all involved in rep type sports. They have multiple practices a week, multiple games for, kids and tournaments and this and that. And so I would say my personal life is dominated by their interest in sports. I don't have a lot of time for hobbies. People say, what is your hobby? And I say, being a mom. Being a mom is my hobby. Because ultimately, it's like, okay, so I'm team mom. Or, team manager or whatever. And so those are the things that I enjoy doing, doing matching water bottles for the kids. Well, there's something that I enjoy. I love a good matching water bottle, if I was being honest. But, it's not very often that I feel like I should have more. I will tell you, over Christmas holidays, there was one day where the kids were all doing things, one was at a friend's house, those kinds of, people, they were doing things. And all of Christmas had been cleaned up. The house was spotless. Laundry was caught up. I was adamant I was taking the day off work. And I looked at my husband and I said, what do we do with this time? I think I shared it, previously, and I didn't know. And he says, you need a hobby. And I thought, and I have laughed about it with a couple of colleagues since, I needed a hobby for one day, but there was no hobby that was going to be one day. There was no hobby that I could fill with that time that then I wouldn't want to, and so I actually in that moment didn't enjoy that time very much. Something to really review and decide why I didn't, but I'm not good with downtime. I like to be busy. So my fine line of what works for my balance, different than a lot of people, and that's okay. And that's kind of the highlight of today's episode is these are some guidelines and things that we need to balance, but how much and where it balances for you might be different than where it balances for someone else. So one of the first ones we're going to get into is being trusting versus being naive. So one of the things that I really feel passionately about in my own business is hiring good people and then giving them the access that they need to do their job. A lot of times I see in the online space, part of a lot of entrepreneur communities, and you see people say, I want to hire an assistant, but I don't want them to have access. And they have like a laundry list of things that they can't have access to. And they said, how do they do their job? They can't, is the very short version. Much like, and I think it's very different when you have someone in your office. If you're hiring, for not a remote position, there's a piece of you see that person every day. There's like a certain level of trust because they come to the office. I just want to let you know that there is no real additional, trust. There's nothing really valid about trusting someone more because you see them in person. Now, I don't have any kind of stat to back that up, but I do have many years of business where I can say that people who we saw in person every day did just as many not great things as people who work in the online space. You're never going to be able to completely keep everything away from that person if you'd like them to do any work, whether that is a client list. And I'll be honest, at one point we had someone leave our team. They took the client list and they emailed them all and said, hey, I used to be with this company and now I'm not. And we can totally provide you the same service for half the price. Are you interested? And it was like that. Is it in our contract vendor agreement that is not allowed? Yes. Is there anything that really in that moment? I mean, sure, I could cause a big, when I look at the cost of actually following through with doing something like that, we didn't. Did we lose one client over it? We did. Were they an ideal client? No. So, there is the chance of things going wrong, but ultimately, you have to be able to provide access. You have to bring people in, do your very best job to vet them, and then you have to allow them to be part of your business. And whether they are online, whether they are in person, whether they are young, whether they are old, whether they are experienced, whether they're all people have the potential of doing something that you would not be happy with. But that must be balanced by not being naive. So one of the things that we see, we use Google Workspace, highly recommend Google Workspace over Microsoft 365, a conversation for another day. But from a business perspective, having Google Workspace and being able to add email addresses as you need, remove email addresses, every single person that we have working for us has an email address. Now, some of those people do not communicate externally. They only communicate with people inside the organization. And one of the questions is, well, couldn't they just use their personal email for that? Couldn't we save, I think it's $12 or around there per month for them to have an email address? Sure. Yep. We totally could do that. However, then that person, when that person leaves, we don't have access to all of their emails. We don't have access and can't shut down access to that account. I can't change the password on someone's personal email address if they're on holidays. I can still I can access that data if I need it. But it also means that if someone leaves and they have been added as a user to all of these different platforms, that I can remove that very quickly and efficiently. Sometimes I see people adding and making admin someone's personal email. The problem is that it becomes very difficult for you to retract that access, for you to pull it all back. When you own the email account, when you own the user data, it makes it much easier. Things like using a password sharing tool. We use 1Password is our encrypted tool for storing passwords. We have all of our passwords saved. So 1Password, and they all have, similar features, but slightly different names. They have vaults. And so we have one vault for each client. And so all of the passwords, logins, anything we have that is, sensitive, maybe a credit card number, that type of thing, all goes in the vault. And only the people who need access to that vault have access to that vault. So it is our management team has access, and then whoever is the employee that's working on that. There's no need for anyone else to have that information. So we just minimize the access. So that is an area where really deciding, obviously Google Workspace has a cost, and it might be a different platform for you. It might be, whatever different pieces specific to your industry, but you need to at times spend a little money to provide yourself with security. You need to, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and make sure that if things fall apart, that you are protected and can claw back what you need to, especially if you're providing your team members access to someone else's, business accounts and that type of thing. The other piece of that where it really comes in is business partnerships. And so often, and I actually was talking about this last week with a client, there's really two ways that people start business partnerships. Either they go in and they do all of the paperwork up front. Maybe they incorporate the business, they get the share certificate. Sometimes they could spend $5,000 getting this all straightened out. And a lot of times those businesses don't go anywhere. The idea kind of fizzles out. Maybe people get different things going on. And so much has been done up front. There's a huge cost. And ultimately, there's a cost to actually taking all of that apart. And so that's kind of option number one. Then we see option number two, where we have kind of what we refer to as the napkin deal. And that is, hey, let's do this. This is kind of the idea. We'll figure it out later. And a lot of times those businesses, they're maybe using resources and other things from, shared businesses. Those ones always require a little bit of cleaning up. But to the same effect, if those ideas fizzle, there's much less cost to taking it apart. You just decide you're not going to do it anymore. So that's the being trusting. But the being naive is to continue growing and scaling a business to any real size without some kind of partnership agreement. And one of the biggest things that we really talk about that people don't think about is if you are in a partnership, so I'll be Betty and I'm going to be in partnership with Sue. And so Betty and Sue are doing business together. Well, now what happens if Sue and her partner, we'll call him Bob for the example, Sue and Bob, they are going to get a divorce. And now Bob is saying, hey, Bob's saying, hey, we got to split all our assets. Half of that value of that business is actually mine. It would be a quarter, I guess, if we've got Betty and Sue who are partners, they're 50-50. And really now Bob is saying, hey, part of that is mine. This can get really messy. What happens also if, now instead we've got Sue and Bob and they're happily married, but something happens to Betty. And Betty's no longer with us. What happens to the business? All of these types of things really need to be spelled out. So it's not always just for the situation of, hey, what if we don't want to do this anymore or anything like that. There's pieces though where we have to, hope for the best, plan for the worst, and make sure that we are covered. We don't want to be naive to the point where it really costs us. Okay, on that same vein, talking about delegating versus doing it yourself. Now, you may say, hey, we've had a few episodes on delegation. We've had a few on outsourcing, lots of different really talented people have offered their opinions in this area. But I want to say we must ride the line where we delegate, but not so much that it takes additional time where it shouldn't. Now, here's the yin versus the yang or the back versus the forth. When you are first delegating, of course, and someone's learning, of course, it's going to take more time for them to do it than it would take you. There's many tasks in our organizations that I could do significantly faster than the person currently doing it. That does not mean that I am the right person to do that job. That just means that I am more efficient than that other person, but they're getting there. So in those situations, I'm not saying take those tasks back because you will just overload yourself. So Dan Martell has a book called Buy Back Your Time. I started listening to this book over the Christmas holidays and have now finished it. And I'm going through some of the time audits and things that he recommends. Highly recommend this book. I keep telling it to everyone, highly recommend. So one of the things that he says is 80% done by someone else is 100% awesome all of the time. And that means if you don't have to do it and that task just gets done, even if it's not exactly how you would do it, that's okay. It is 100% awesome because ultimately you're trying to buy back your time. Okay, so what is the flip side to that? If you're doing things that start to feel less like efficiency and more about being, the leader and more about, I don't do those things anymore, that's where we run into a problem. So things like, hey, you're going to take something and you're going to forward it to someone else and say, please print this. Now, if you were going to print it yourself, that would have been 3 clicks. The email that over was maybe 8 clicks, and now you've interrupted someone else's day and they're going to go do that. Things like that are silly. And you might say, who would ever do that? I bring it up because I've seen this. It's the same thing as, just moving tasks, thinking about tasks as a potato and it having to go all the way around. Maybe it's the fact that, you have multiple people that have similar roles. Maybe you've expanded your business and you have a couple of leaders. But instead of saying, I'm going to give this task to this leader and they can go do it, instead we need to get all of the leaders together and we need to, debate and go on. There will always be things where adding everyone's opinions will be helpful, but there are other things where it just needs to get done. And if one person can do it, there's no need to add 3 more. It's the same thing as, big CCs in emails. If, we'll just CC everyone. Well, every person has to read that email. Every person has to go through. One of the things in corporate that we really noticed in my time in corporate, as the business grew, it was emails that went out to the staff all really needed to be vetted. Because if every single person in the company was going to stop what they were doing, open their email, read the email, think, does this pertain to me? Why are they sending me this? Is this important? And then they would get back to their work. That was a significant amount of time. And sure, when it was 3 people, maybe it wasn't. But when it became 50 people, that's a lot of time. If you think about if it takes 1 minute and you have 50 people, well, that's 50 minutes. You have almost an hour of wasted time. And it could be on something silly that really, it needed to go to 1 person or 2 people. As the company gets bigger and you have, hundreds of people, every single thing that goes out to an all email address is a significant amount of time. It is an investment. You are investing in paying those people all to read that message. Is it relevant? So when we look at, delegating versus doing it yourself, it really comes back to protecting time. It really comes back to deciding when are we going to invest time into something that gets us further. Teaching someone something, it might take time, but in the end, that person's going to take that task off your plate entirely. Versus just deciding that someone else could do it for you. And it feels good to have someone else do it for you. That's not what we're doing here. So there's that fine line. Okay. Taking advice versus losing your own voice. So often we consume content and it's really great content. I just talked about reading/listening to Dan Martell's book. Fabulous, fabulous content. I would say about 80% of it applies to me and would be something I would consider implementing. 20% definitely no. And of that 80%, it's really not a decision. We're going through. But there's always this balance of, do I not want to even look at that concept because I'm being closed-minded, because I should be looking at that, but I don't want to? It makes me think a little bit, I don't know if you remember, there was like this Nanny 911 show on TV when I was young. And it was, families that were having trouble with their children would call the nanny and she would come in and she would observe and then she would show them the way. None of those people thought those ideas were, at times she really had to say like, this is the way, this is how we do it. And so, sometimes that is what needs to be done. And so deciding when we're not listening to something because we're being closed-minded versus when we're not listening to something because it really doesn't apply to us, And so lots of advice will come your way, tons of content, information, advice, recommendations, deciding who actually can provide content, information, advice that you find valuable. If you look at someone and what they're doing and you don't want to be doing that or the way that they're doing it, then their advice might not be the most valuable. Does that mean that all of their advice is terrible? No, but it's finding that line and making sure that you're not jumping between different pieces of advice. Because if you have 5 different people that you listen to and you take a little bit of one plan and a little bit of the other plan and a little bit of the other plan, and then it doesn't work, you can't say, well, all of those people don't know what they're talking about, because ultimately you didn't actually implement any one of their plans. You kind of piecemealed it together. And at times that might be what your business needs. A lot of the other time, there was a strategy to a whole plan. And so again, it's that yin versus yang, riding the fine line of deciding what works for you, throwing out the rest, but not doing so in a way that is just closed-minded, being willing to at least hear other ideas and how they might work for you. And this, it's not lost on me that is conflicting and confusing, but that is part of being a business owner. There's so much information coming in, and ultimately deciding what information you find valuable is super important because, as we talked about, reading all those emails, consuming, is time consuming. So if you're taking the time to listen to just a crazy amount of advice and you're not listening to what you think, your intuition, that can really, really slow down success. Most plans, most strategies, most things require multiple steps. So if you're only doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this, chances are you're not going to get to where the end destination of any one of those plans. So unless you are going to take the bits and pieces and create a strategy and plan around them, it's not really going to work. Okay. Trusting the process versus lack of results. On one side, we have the business owner who turns something on. Maybe it's Google Ads, maybe it's a new website, maybe it's something happens. And then 2 days later, they're like, it didn't work. Nothing happened. My phone didn't ring. On the way other flip side, we have the business owner that has, maybe using those Google Ads as an example, I've been spending $1,500 a month on Google Ads for the last 6 months, and I don't think it's done anything. But the person's really nice. He answers all my questions. He's very nice. Neither are good. There's a balance between trusting the process and making sure that you're getting what you're paying for. And so questions up front before you commit are things like, how long between when I sign and when I can expect results? How long is that time? In your experience, how long does it take to be implemented and start to see the value? Something like implementing a new system, job management system. So let's use, for example, maybe it's Jobber, something along those lines where, fields, or it's something where your team is all going to be using this system. I can tell you that on day 1, your team is not loving the system. Not all of them. You might have a couple of people that are like, this is amazing. This is great. I can totally see the benefit. But you might have other people that are like, I just liked doing it the old way. It was faster. I didn't really have to think about it. I knew where all the buttons were. And so you can't expect on day 1 for people to feel the benefit, the reprieve of innovation, the reprieve of efficiency. It doesn't happen on day 1. But there is a timeline to when that is expected. There is a timeline for when we should be waving the red flag saying, hey, I think this is not quite right. Back to our Google Ads example. So often, people are running ads without a way to understand if they're working. So just asking someone on your lead form, how did you hear about us, is actually not useful. A lot of people don't really know where they heard about you, or maybe they saw you in multiple places but don't remember which was the first one. Having the information and built in, so UTM parameters is typically how this is done, source tracking, all of these types of things. It allows us to say, hey, this new client, they came in through the Google ad in campaign A and they saw ad D and it worked. So over time, we can say, oh, that campaign A, ad D, it delivers great clients all the time. Whatever we're doing there, we need to do more of that. Okay. But if that's not set up and you're just pouring money in, you have no idea if you're getting results. You can discern, hey, we seem busier. We went from partially booked out to fully booked out. But most times you're doing more than one thing at the same time. If you've said, hey, we're quiet and we need to ramp up sales, we're gonna go. Maybe you're doing more social media. Maybe you're doing more networking. Maybe you turned ads on. Maybe you're doing maybe your team is bringing in more referrals. You don't know what's actually working. So you want to make sure that you have a measurable result, and you want to make sure that you can confirm that there are results. But to that same effect, if you've hired someone and you haven't asked how long the expectation is to see a result, it's a good question to ask now. Especially if you're, on day 1, day 2, day 7, you're like, hey, it's not working. You need to find out what can be expected. Because oftentimes, if someone Google ads, a much faster result than investing in SEO. So if someone says, hey, I want to invest in, we're super quiet. We need to fill, I have a big project about 6 months down the road, but I really need to fill this current time. We're going to start working on SEO. I will say, no, that's not a good use of that investment. If you're trying to fill the immediate, you need paid traffic. If you're trying to fill 6 months from now, let's do SEO. You've reversed the two strategies. You want traffic today, you buy it. If you want, Google to help people find you and you're going to build up this online presence, you have more time. So that balance of trust the process versus lack of results. If you have something that you're paying for that you don't know if it's working, now's a good time to find out, how do we measure if it's working, and when are we supposed to know if it's working? If that timeline has passed, maybe it's a good time to set a meeting with that person who's working in your business and say, okay, so here's where we're at. We've been investing for X, number of months or whatever, and we're not seeing real tangible results. I'm not saying there aren't results. I'm just saying we're struggling to measure them. Can we sit down and can we talk this through and decide how best we measure these results, and how can we decide where this is, best benefiting the business? That's not the same as, hey, I don't think this is working. Are you even doing anything? Two very different discussions, and you're going to get two very different responses. So, we've got being trusting versus being naive. It's a fine line. You have to trust, but don't be naive. Delegating versus just doing it yourself. You know that I talk about delegating, but don't be delegating so much that really a couple of clicks would have just done the task for you. Taking advice versus losing your own voice. Decide which information is valuable to you and which information is not. Trusting the process versus lack of results. Guys, I can't say enough. You have to trust the process, but you also have to make sure you're getting results. All of these real examples of riding the fine line. Making sure that you're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. There's no right and wrong here in terms of which is best for you. It depends on where you are in your business. It depends on how big your team is. It depends on what objective you're looking for. But no matter what you're doing, you will have to balance these somehow. Guys, that's all for today. Until next time. Don't forget to click subscribe, comment below, and share the episode with a fellow entrepreneur. If you want to take us on the road, we are available everywhere you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much. See you next time.